Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Justin. So I'm happy to be here today, and I'm excited about seeing Resilience. I have seen it before, but it's been a little while, and I think you'll really enjoy the movie. I also recognize that this is kind of like coming to the movie before it starts, you know, and watching all those ads and stuff before the movie. Many of you are probably here to see the movie. So when I talk for the next hour or so about trauma, I do want to encourage any of you that have comments or questions about anything to raise your hand and jump in along the way, because I do want to make this as helpful and useful for all of you as possible. I think a lot of what I'm going to say is consistent with what you're going to see in Resilience, but there are going to be some differences as well, and I'll try to touch on some of those along the way, and then in the discussion afterwards maybe we can talk about some of those. So I am from the Child Health and Development Institute of Connecticut, and what we do is work with state agencies, community-based mental health providers, family advocates, and academic institutions, really anybody in the state that is serving children and families. And we try to raise the standard of care that's provided through those systems and services. A lot of what we do is to bring research and evidence about what works and what's effective and what's efficient to the systems and programs that serve children and families. My main area is in trauma and in mental health services for children and youth. And so I'll be touching on, obviously, a lot about trauma and on some specific mental health services that are available for children exposed to trauma. So here's what I hope you all get out of the next hour, is to learn a little bit about trauma and what the effects of trauma are on children throughout childhood and into adulthood, to talk about some strategies that you can put into place relatively easily. Some are easier than others to address and mitigate the impact of trauma. And then also to identify some other resources that you may not be aware of, you maybe are aware of, for children or families that need some additional support. And then I think all of this is really to kind of prep you for Resilience, and then to generate some discussion afterwards about what you can do as a community to try to address this issue. So one of the things that I think is really important about trauma to acknowledge right off the bat is that it's incredibly difficult to talk about. And these are some of the faces of trauma that we see. And when you talk about children who've experienced trauma or youth who've experienced trauma, it's really tough. And this is our, in a way, a protective response that people have, is we don't want to talk about bad things, we don't want to think about bad things that happened, and we certainly don't want to cause children or families distress by talking about things that may be upsetting to them. And so, as a natural kind of consequence to that, sometimes, we avoid either asking about traumatic events or talking about them, or even acknowledging that they've happened. And what I hope to kind of convey to you is that, one, that's normal and it's common everywhere, but two, that avoidance may be a problem for addressing trauma, and I think it's something that as a community you may want to think about. How can you begin to break down some of the anxiety or the concerns about talking about trauma in ways that that can help children and families and make it okay to talk about. So I've said the word trauma a lot of times already, and what does that mean? The answer is that there is really no consensus definition. I've given you one here from SAMHSA, which really talks about an event, series of events or circumstances that's experienced as emotionally or physically harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the child or the person experiencing it. There's a lot of definitions of trauma. You're going to hear in the movie about adversity and adverse child experiences. But for everything that I'm talking about today, I think we're talking about things that are either a single moment or an ongoing experience that has harmful effects or the potential to have harmful effects. And that's one of the things about trauma, is that not every type of trauma or every trauma does have long-lasting harmful effects. But some do, and depending on the circumstances, that's more or less likely. So you're going to hear in resilience quite a bit about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, the ACE study. And how many of you are familiar with that study? All right, great. How many of you would you say are very familiar with that study? All right, good. So, so one of the distinctions that I want to make about trauma and ACEs is that we're kind of all talking about the same types of things, these bad things that happen to people that cause potentially long-term effects. But you can see that there are some differences, and the blue circle on the left is what we kind of consider as classic or trauma, or how trauma is defined in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And there's a whole body of research and evidence on this type of trauma, and it includes life-threatening events like community violence, school violence, sudden death of a loved one. And then on the other side, we have ACEs, which are 10 types of events that were developed through the ACEs study that look at not only things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, but also adversity like having parents divorce and having parents with mental illness. And so there is a little bit of overlap here in terms of the trauma world and the ACE world, but you can see there's actually more that's different than is similar. So how often does trauma happen to children? This is a slide with some data from a nationally representative study. And this was basically conducted as telephone interviews. Households are selected based on geography, race, age, ethnicity, gender, and they sampled through telephone interviews what parents reported their children had been exposed to. And I believe if the child was old enough, the child reported themselves. So through this study and other studies like it, we know that the rates of exposure to trauma are actually very, very high. And this is something that, maybe those of you in the room, it doesn't come as a surprise to, but I think to the general public, it's actually surprising for people to see that almost 1 out of 4 girls will be sexually abused in their childhood. Almost 1 out of 5 boys will be sexually abused in their childhood. And that on average, 71% of all kids will be exposed to at least one of these types of traumas by the time they're 17. And actually, most of those kids are not just exposed to one type, they're exposed to multiple types or multiple events over time. And again, this is not a sample of youth or families in the most dangerous communities or the communities with the most poverty. This is a nationally representative sample. And certainly there are variations in communities where there is more poverty or more crime, children are exposed at even higher rates. We also know that most exposure to trauma is not known, it's not reported. And there are a lot of reasons for that, one of which is the avoidance that I mentioned earlier. Right? So people don't like to talk about the bad things that happen. Children certainly don't like to talk about the bad things that happen to them. Some types of abuse are coercive, where an adult who's physically or sexually abusing a child threatens a child, tells them not to tell anyone. And even if that doesn't happen, there's sometimes just a kind of an unspoken rule in a community or in a family where we don't talk about that. And what that means is that many children are experiencing these traumatic events and these adverse experiences without sometimes anybody knowing about it. So maybe their parent or their caregiver doesn't know about it. And even if the parent or caregiver does know about it, often that's it. There's no services available or nobody else knows about it. So if you're in a school or you're in a, if you're working in child welfare and juvenile justice or in some other program, the research says that the kids there, have high rates of trauma, and that most of that is not reported or known. Any questions about that? Comments?
I'm actually surprised that the sexual victimization in ages 2 through 5 is as low as it is, or in 6 through 9. I bet it's higher.
Yeah, and you're probably right. I mean, who can really? We can't really know very well the true rate of these things because, if you think about the way even these data were collected, where a random person calling up parents all across the country and saying, I want you to participate in a survey about adversity that your child may have experienced. So, I think given that these rates are, kind of scary, that people endorse that level of trauma. And of course, there are going to be more that say, no, it didn't happen when it did. And there have been some other studies that try to look at, what the rates are in surveys like this compared to the known rates in child welfare abuse. And they're between 10 and 40 times more kids, are endorsed here than are known to child welfare, for example. So one thing that I think is important to think about is how a child experiences a traumatic event, and then how that may go on to impact how they do in school, at home, with friends, and throughout development. So this is some examples of how we would hope that children are kind of functioning throughout the day. They're focused on their daily activities. They're experiencing a range of feelings. They're, wanting to learn. Their breathing and heart rate are normal. And this is not an exhaustive list. They're feeling connected to others. We hope kids are experiencing, many or all of these things. Now, when kids are faced with a threat, and it's not just kids, when any of us is faced with a threat, especially a serious threat or a life-threatening event, we have a biological response that kicks in, right? Our survival response, there's a fight or flight response that kicks in. So if a child is, at home and there's a domestic violence incident, parents are arguing or yelling or shoving or getting violent, what is that child going to experience in that moment? I'm so glad a lot of you said something, but I couldn't hear any of them because there were so many. Anxiety, yep. What else? Fear. Yes. And how about in the body? How does the body respond physically? Numb, maybe? Yep.
Heart beating real fast.
Heart beating fast, yeah. Fight or flight, yes.
Sweating, clammy.
Yep, thank you. Sweating, clammy, yes. So that physiological response happens, instantaneously. It's our survival mechanism, right? And millions of years ago, when man was out, walking in the wild, and wild animals were threatening them, this response protected us, and it still protects us. If there's a true threat, that fight or flight response can help protect us. When we kind of go into that survival response, one of the things that happens is the blood flows from your core and your brain to your extremities to get you ready to fight or flight. Your thinking is kind of impaired because you're reacting on instinct, survival. And some of the other things that people describe, are numbness, having what's called reality confusion. Things feel like a dream, or they may not be real. Sometimes people report dissociation, or feeling like they're hovering above their body and looking down at themselves. And it's thought that may be a protective mechanism for dealing with these events. And at the core, trauma is really about a sense of loss of control. People who are, and children who are in these life-threatening situations feel a loss of control over everything, over their ability to do anything about it. So that is before I move on, that is a normal biological response we all have, right? It's protective, it helps us, and if you're outside and a dog is running up to you, barking, growling, threatening you, that survival response can help you fight off the dog, run away, and keep yourself safe. And same if you're driving down the highway and somebody cuts in front of you, and you kind of automatically swerve or do what you need to do to keep yourself safe. There's an innate response that kicks in. Where this becomes or can become problematic is that survival response can start to kick in at times where there is no true threat. And there's it's not the only way that trauma affects people, but just as an example, for a child who's witnessed a domestic violence incident like this, sometimes those children may be very sensitive to yelling, shouting, loud noises, threats or intimidation. And then perhaps that child's in school and a teacher starts raising her voice and yelling, and all of a sudden that child experiences the traumatic event as if it were happening again. And we hear this from, you hear this now in the news with veterans coming back from the wars where, a car backfires and the vet jumps under the bed because he feels like or she feels like they're under fire. Children can experience the same types of reactions. And, we've seen lots of examples where these reactions to non-life-threatening events are confusing, and people that are present in the school have no idea what's happening or what's going on with this kid, and they say what's wrong with him? Why is he acting like that? And because most people don't know about the trauma that kids have experienced, they wouldn't know. There'd be no way to know. So in addition to having that fight or flight response that can come back at other times, there are a number of other effects of trauma. There's, and I think of this as, I think of these effects as kind of like an iceberg, right? There's I keep trying this laser pointer and it's still not working, so I gotta learn not to do that. But there's these effects that you can see clearly, or generally, pretty obvious to most people who know a child. Aggression, anger, irritability, we can all see that pretty clearly. Behavior issues, risk-taking behaviors, sometimes self-injury, cutting, or other types of self-injury. Being easily scared or startled, so if a door slams, the kid that, kind of jumps up and is always looking anxious. And then, other things like aches and pains or being really clingy, especially for younger kids, being really clingy to a parent. So these are things that are associated with trauma, but not specific to trauma. And that's one of the challenges with trauma, is that many of the signs and symptoms are common with other either normal development or other types of mental health problems. If you go a little bit deeper with trauma, some of the other things that you often see are what we call executive functioning impairments, so difficulty problem solving, planning ahead, thinking about the consequences of actions, as well as sleep problems, social withdrawal, appetite, mood changes, being sad. Those are things that, still, if you know a child fairly well, you may have a sense of, and if not, you may not know much about. So as an example, many teachers in school, sometimes they know that a child, is having trouble sleeping at night, but often they don't. And often, it looks like the kid is inattentive, not focusing, not interested, falling asleep during class. And there are a lot of different ways of interpreting that child's behavior. And I think a symptom of trauma, or he or she can't sleep because they're having nightmares or trouble falling asleep, that's not one of the first things that, that most of us think about or that teachers think about. At the bottom level, in terms of trauma symptoms, and I apologize, these are a little hard to see, are the things that are really often unknown or difficult to detect. So hypervigilance, being always alert and sensitive to danger or threats. Intrusive thoughts, so that's when kids have images about a past traumatic event or other distressing event come into their head when they don't want them to. Negative thoughts about themselves or the world, like I'm no good, the world is not a safe place, nobody loves me, nobody's going to care for me. Anxiety, fear, terror, emotional numbing, feeling nothing, feeling no emotion at all. And shame and guilt. So feeling guilty about what happened and shame about a traumatic event. And those feelings are very common even for children who've experienced things that are in no way their fault. And I've seen this time and again where a child who'd been physically abused or sexually abused or even had a relative die suddenly, for some reason he or she made the connection that something he or she did caused the abuse or caused the relative to die, even when there's no logical connection. And so that sense of shame and guilt is very, very powerful, and it's also one of those things that kids rarely talk about, and in some ways are, in some ways may even be discouraged to talk about. All right, so this is kind of a laundry list of signs and symptoms that that children may experience or you may see, but I think one of the most challenging things about trauma is that it is difficult to identify, it's difficult to diagnose, and it's difficult to know what's trauma and what's something else. Kids who have been exposed to trauma, now there's a lot of research showing because of all of the common signs and symptoms between trauma and some of these other conditions, it's often misdiagnosed. And so we see a lot of kids who've been diagnosed with ADHD or sometimes conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and those labels are, as probably most of you know, those labels are not great for kids to have. A conduct disorder, an oppositional defiant disorder label, those are very pejorative diagnoses. But we see that all the time, especially with adolescents. And when they get into some of the risk-taking or the anger and aggression types of behaviors, that's how they're labeled. When truly, they've experienced traumatic events and they're suffering from that. Same with learning difficulties, academic difficulties, and a number of these other things.
I wanted to get back to the two slides before.
Oh, before that?
Previous list, I would add about 5, 6 self-medication, eating disorders, a whole bunch of things that tell me, we go to the homes of people, that tell me there's something wrong in this home. There's a canary in the coal mine situation. I can see the canary. How long is the canary going to be living?
Yeah.
And what will the family do if the canary dies?
Yes.
So we really need to know about the self-medication or those other things that children do, eating disorders.
Yes.
Yeah. Is a problem.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with you. And substance abuse, self-medication certainly should be up there. I kind of ran out of room on the triangle, but I think there's a lot of other, and that's what makes it so complex is that
This thing about see me is, this post-it. This is what I look at. Who am I looking at when I sit with a person?
Yes, thank you for adding that. Okay, so it sounds like many of you are familiar with the ACE study, and you're going to hear more about this in Resilience, so I'm not going to actually say too much about the ACE study right now. It was a big study. The one thing which may or not be mentioned in the film is that it was done on mostly a white middle class sample initially. I think since then there's been a lot more research, but initially it was a white middle class sample, and they found this very strong relationship between adversity in childhood and then a number of health and mental health conditions in adulthood, so mood disorders, anxiety disorders. And what these are showing you is for people that experienced 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more adverse child experiences in childhood, what was their risk of impulse control, substance abuse, anxiety, and mood disorders. So you can see there's a clear increase in risk of those things happening in adulthood based on their childhood experiences. The same is true for health conditions like heart disease, stroke, COPD, diabetes, STDs. And they found this, and subsequent hundreds of studies related to this have found these relationships for virtually every health outcome that they've looked at being associated with the childhood adversity. Was there a question or a comment about this? Yes.
The ACE study resulted in a screening tool, right?
So that, well, the ACE study, and you'll hear more about this, and this may be a good thing for us to discuss too afterwards. The ACE study is based on 10 ACEs, and in that first slide with the bubbles I showed you, there actually were, it listed what the 10 of them were. It was things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, parent mental illness, parent who was incarcerated. Those 10 items or adversities were developed for the initial studies to look at these connections. They weren't developed as a screening tool per se. They were developed to look at the research, but they've since been used as a screening tool. And so now a lot of what people are thinking about is how do we screen people for adversity and trauma. And the ACEs is one measure that people use. And I think there's some benefits to it, obviously all of the research on it, and also some limitations in terms of it doesn't cover all the adversities that we know are out there. And it wasn't necessarily developed as a screening tool to screen for for symptoms or those that need services. But we can probably talk more about that in the discussion. So trauma also, trauma affects learning and education. And I know there's some school folks in here. There's now been research that links adversity and trauma to all of these academic outcomes. The attendance and absenteeism, very strongly associated with trauma. And just anecdotally, I've seen kids over the years where they don't want to go to school because they're worried if they leave their mom at home, she's going to be hurt again or beaten up again. And so they're not going to school, but there's a real reason behind that. That's not just I don't want to be in school. And certainly that's not all kids, but it does happen. Grades, GPA, achievement, we know that they're more likely to be suspended and expelled. And again, that may be related to the types of behaviors and symptoms that are seen, especially the acting out and aggressive behaviors. Also more likely to be in special education. And again, that may be tied to misdiagnosis of their condition and a lack of recognition about trauma. Related to ACEs, there's now this really increasing field of brain research that shows that children who've experienced these types of adversities, they cause or they're associated with changes in brain development. These are a couple of extreme examples of extreme neglect that show, in the top one, differences in brain size for a 3-year-old, and down here, in the parts of the brain that are activated between a child who was not abused and one who was abused. But there's now research showing changes in neurotransmitters and stress response when children are exposed to trauma. The good news is that there's also now evidence that effective treatment and services can sometimes reverse those changes and in the brain structure. And there's also a whole field of genetics research that looks at the impact of trauma on genetics, and that it actually can cause some changes in in the genetic makeup of people, and that potentially could even be transmitted intergenerationally. So the effects of trauma, not only are intergenerational in terms of, parents who experience trauma can pass that on socially, but genetically it can be passed on.
So it's an epigenetic kind of, are we going to see more about that?
That may be in the movie.
Leave it alone.
Yeah.
As a result of therapy, can it change back?
There is some evidence now that as a result of therapy or effective services, some of those biological changes can be reversed. Yeah. I think that's really a relatively new area. But part of it is that children's brains are so adaptive and flexible, and especially if we can intervene early, there's a lot more room for for addressing these things.
So
Yeah.
I guess I just had one question. So not only is the construction between the two images on the top left, like the way the brain develops different, but the size actually is to scale.
Yes, and that's I do want to highlight that's an extreme example of neglect. I believe that's from orphanage in Romania, where there truly was, extensive neglect, probably beyond what we normally see here. But it's just to show that it's possible that level of neglect can result in, very significant changes. Also a link with juvenile justice. So this is some research relatively recently from Florida looking at, I believe, all the youth in their juvenile justice system and the relationship between childhood trauma and adversity and their risk of reoffending. And I think the highlight here is that as the ACE score increases, really above about 4, those youth who had a score higher than 4 on the ACE survey were the high risk of recidivism. And so if you think about kind of the longer term impact of trauma, on health, mental health, substance abuse. This is juvenile justice involvement, but we all know that kids who are involved in the juvenile justice system then are at increased risk of involvement with the adult criminal system, and it really is a pathway, unfortunately, to incarceration. And then finally, in terms of the effects, there are very significant economic impacts of trauma. And when you add up all of these costs for additional health care, juvenile justice involvement, criminal justice involvement, the lost productivity of folks that, instead of being out in the community and perhaps working, are incarcerated, you get this figure of about $1.8 million per child in lifetime costs. And then in terms of life expectancy, children who've experienced 6 or more of these adverse events have an average life expectancy of 60 years compared to 80 years for children that haven't experienced any adversities. And that 20-year gap is really, is bigger than for drug users, for people with diabetes, for most other major medical conditions, that 20-year gap. So now I want to talk a little bit about what can be done. All right, so that was kind of the, the sober news, the bad news about trauma, how awful it is, how much lifelong damage it can do, how costly it is. But I do want to make sure that we talk a little bit about, and you'll see in Resilience, the title of the movie, Resilience, I think speaks to it, that there are some things that we can do and that we know are effective. So Oprah is on here because Oprah often attributes her success to overcoming terrible sexual abuse and other forms of trauma that she endured as a child. And she attributes her ability to empathize and connect with people in part because she was able to survive and face those experiences. And there's this kind of new field of research looking at post-traumatic growth, which is not only can people recover from these these types of experiences, but they can actually, in a way, grow and use them or experience them in a way that they not only recover to where they were, but they feel like they're functioning at a higher level. And it's kind of that adage that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And if people do get support and services, they have the feeling like, I lived through this, I beat it, I'm strong. And sometimes they want to then use that in positive ways, help other people who've experienced trauma, or turn that into something positive. We know that children are resilient. I mentioned that brains are adaptable, especially in early childhood, but all throughout childhood. And we do now have hundreds and hundreds of prevention and intervention services that are shown to work for children who've experienced trauma. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those. One thing that I do want to mention is that Connecticut is often, despite how it often feels on the ground to you all and to others, it actually has a lot more resources than many other states do. And we've had now for at least the last 10 years a fairly considerable focus on childhood trauma. And I'll just mention a couple of the highlights on here. I will pass the slides out to Justin so you have them later on if you want. Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry, I should have said that in the beginning. You'll get slides. So what Connecticut has done is begun to offer trauma services to children across the state. I'll go over some of where that's located. There's a map here, but I'll give you some more information on that. Those are trauma-specific mental health services. And then also in some of the different state systems like child welfare and juvenile justice, they've begun to take steps to addressing trauma in their systems, training their staff to understand and recognize it, screening, and becoming better aware of services. So a big part of this is, of course, the earlier we start, the better the outcomes, and the more the more effect we can have at less cost. And if we back this all the way up, the best thing we can do is prevent a child from experiencing any trauma in the first place, or prevent as much as possible. And so this is where the world of trauma really overlaps with the world of pro-social development, positive relationships, healthy attachment, and probably some of the other programs that you already have here in Middletown. Other services like in-home home visitors, Triple P or Circle of Security, things like that are focused on developing healthy attachments and relationships. We also can, the earlier we screen and identify children and parents for being at risk of trauma or for having experienced trauma, the better. And building resiliency, through attachment and caregiving skills, again, like Circle of Security, Triple P, and those other types of programs. All right, I want to pause for a second, show you a short baby video, because I know people always like these.
Baby. Does Mommy's nose scare you when I blow it? Does that scare you when Mommy blows her nose? Yeah? You silly baby.
All right. So I show you that as an example of a little baby who's kind of traumatized by a tissue, by mommy blowing her nose. But the point I want to make here is that the single best thing for children who've experienced trauma is what? All right, I heard parent interaction and then dealing with it. Yep. So those are both true. It's it's having a caregiver, some adult, who is there to help them regulate their emotion, understand what happened, and get through it. And often it's a parent. In this case, mom was probably blowing her nose. The kid, for whatever reason, was terrified of that. And then when mom put down the tissue, you can imagine mom was probably smiling and making, baby face, or making, those faces that we make at babies. And, immediately the child was no longer scared. Was happy and smiling. As soon as the tissue went up, the baby was terrified again. But it was mom, looking at that baby, showing her that everything was okay, smiling, reassuring, that help that baby to regulate. And all of that, there's a lot of things we can do to help kids, but the number one is having a caregiver, anybody. If not a parent, it could be a grandparent, it could be a social worker, it could be a mentor, helping that child to regulate and understand.
A lot of us play peekaboo with our kids,
Mm-hmm.
and we get the same reaction almost.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is that let me say, across cultures? That kind
That's
of
a good question.
kids, or do you know anything about that?
The reaction, you mean?
The idea that
Oh, peekaboo.
Peekaboo.
That's a good question. I don't know if peekaboo is cross. I don't know if anybody else knows. If
We do that in India.
You do that in India? It's definitely cross-cultural.
Tickling,
Yeah.
yeah. So that that is the single biggest thing that we can do, and the earlier we can do that, the better. You all heard these terms: trauma-informed care, trauma-informed system, trauma-informed approach. This is becoming kind of buzzwords lately, right? And does anybody know what that means? Nobody?
In terms of treatment, you mean?
Well, what does trauma-informed care mean?
I think that approaching it from this perspective of this is their experience, this is the needs that they have, and I'm thinking of it in schools. You were talking about discipline and suspensions, and instead of saying you're a bad kid and you're behaving badly,
Yeah.
looking at this is what is going on with them and their developing brain and their life, and how can we support them instead of disciplining.
Yes, so that's a great example of trying to put something like this into practice. And when I asked you what trauma-informed care was, it's kind of a trick question because it's a hard thing to define. We're hearing a lot about it, and everybody's saying we should do this thing called trauma-informed care, but putting it into practice, and I think that's probably what you're going to talk about after the movie, it is challenging because it's a little bit amorphous. And what I want to describe is kind of like how I think about it, although I do want to say that there's lots and lots of articles and stuff on this now, and everybody kind of defines it a little bit differently. So the way that I think about it at the highest level and most basic level is in these three buckets: workforce development. So that's anybody that's working with children or families to have the knowledge and training about trauma, to understand it, to respond to children and families, to address some of the examples that you just gave in a school. What do we do differently? How do we think about things differently because of all this knowledge and research about trauma? The second is trauma-focused services. So that's things like screening and providing specific preventions or intervention programs. Again, like could be PPP or Circle Security or other mental health interventions, which I'll talk about. And then the third kind of big bucket is organizational environmental practices. And that's everything from policy, what do policies say about trauma, to in some cases the physical environment, like how is an office or a facility set up, and how might a child who's experienced trauma experience, one example of that we've seen is, parking lots are often dark, there's not enough light. And children and families who've experienced trauma, that's a a tough thing for them to walk through the parking lot at night if it's dark. But it's also, how is a room set up? How is a therapy room or a playroom set up? And is it responsive to those children and families? But I think, somebody kind of mentioned or alluded to this. This is really a key in thinking about trauma. Instead of saying what's wrong with you, instead asking what's happened to you. And so often, when a kid acts up in school or, in a program, the first thing we say is, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing that? And I think it's changing, the way that we view behaviors and trying to understand what's behind it. And I've got kids, and I still sometimes say, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing that? And I try to correct myself, but I think there's almost always something behind the behavior, especially the aggressive and angry, irritable behavior. There's always something underneath anger, and often it's easier for a kid, especially for a teenager, to be angry and to yell than it is to say, I'm feeling hurt, or I'm feeling scared, or I'm feeling worried about something. In terms of workforce development, I mentioned training, but also some other areas like who do we hire? What knowledge about trauma do they have? Supervision, performance reviews, and then one thing that we think a lot about is developing champions. Who are the people in your program or agency that are really interested and willing to kind of go the extra step and to try to think about how do we do this? We call them trauma champions, and I think probably because you're here today, many of you may be trauma champions for wherever you go back and thinking about how can we move on this. Also related to professional development, I think one of the most underlooked areas is staff wellness and the wellness of the people that are caring for children and families. None of us are in this job for the money. We're doing it because we think it's important. And even before the current economic climate at the state level and at the federal level, there are not enough resources to go around. And now there may be even fewer resources to go around. And that puts more of a burden on staff and professionals that are doing this work. And so if you're going to do trauma work, you have to pay attention to the people that are doing it, because they cannot, it's the oxygen mask, put on your own oxygen mask before you put on your child's oxygen mask. You have to put on your staff's oxygen mask before they can do this work with families. Trauma screening, so in that second bucket of trauma-focused services, the point I made earlier in the beginning was most trauma is not known, and most kids don't volunteer it, most families don't volunteer these things. However, we're finding more and more that when people are asked a direct question, they do often volunteer it. Not always, and certainly, some people continue to not want to talk about these things. But when you ask a direct question and you frame it from a perspective of, we think it's important to understand some of the things you may have experienced. We think it's important for your health, your well-being, for your ability to function in school. And so, we want to talk to you a little bit about some of the adversity that you may have experienced. And you'll see this in the film in a number of different settings in schools and in pediatric practices. And this is something that I really feel very strongly about, is that we should be doing more screening of children and parents earlier on, before the problems become so serious and significant that kids are recognized, for behavior issues rather than for the trauma. Okay. Just one example, there are lots of ways of screening. The ACE has been used as a screen. There's a short screen that I want to mention because it's now being used by Child Welfare, DCF in Connecticut, as well as the juvenile justice system to screen all kids in the JJ system. And this is one that we worked with DCF to develop through a federal grant a few years ago. It's 10 questions, it's very brief, it's free, it's on our website if you want to see it. And it's not the only screen by any means, there's lots and lots of them, but it was developed to try to find something very quick and easy that could be used. One of the things that we've been training people now to screen for trauma in mental health, in child welfare, in juvenile justice, in schools, pediatric practices, and these are some of the concerns that we often hear. One, I'll re-traumatize a kid by asking them these questions. And we've started to collect data now, as research on this, that addresses some of these concerns. And I think that speaks to the avoidance issue. Is like we don't want to cause anybody distress. As they do no harm, do no harm first. But what the research has increasingly shown is that by asking these questions, it's very, very rare you're going to re-traumatize a child or overly distress them. And in fact, most children and caregivers are appreciative if it's done in an engaging way. If it's not done as a research study where you just say, tell me this, 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 and this, but you use it as an engagement strategy. Say, this is why it's important, this is why we talk about it, and we're considering it. They actually feel some sense of relief that they're even being asked. And we've had people say, nobody's ever asked me, if I've been abused, and or nobody's ever asked me if I've been affected by the death of my grandma. Sometimes people also worry they won't hear anything new. Hopefully, with the data that I showed you earlier, you will appreciate that you probably, without screening, you probably don't know, half or more of what kids have experienced. And in some child welfare workers that we've had screen kids, there were kids that were known to them for more than a year. They've been on their caseload, worked with that family for more than a year. They did this 10-question screen, and most of the time, they learned new information, from that 10-question screen about trauma exposure or symptoms that their kids had had. Okay. So talking with families about trauma, and this is one that is, just like screening is difficult, right? And it's difficult even if how many clinicians are in the room? Therapists, yeah. So even if you're a therapist and you haven't had this training or experience before, it can be difficult. And if you're not a therapist, you may be thinking, well, I'm not a therapist. How can I talk to people about this issue? And I think one of my colleagues, Alice Forrester at Clifford Beer's clinic, always says, and I think it's so true, that the issue of trauma is not going to be solved by therapists. It's going to be solved by everybody else who begins to talk about and be comfortable talking about trauma with families. Because there just are not enough therapists to go around to address the issue. Sorry. So in terms of talking about it, there's some strategies. One is being transparent is very important. I gave a couple of examples of how you might introduce talking about it with a family or a child. Of course, you want to be transparent. If you're a mandated reporter, that's a possibility. We actually find that despite what people think, they are not ending up making a whole lot of mandated reports. They are learning new information and finding things out, but they're not reaching the level of requiring a mandated report. Providing information about trauma. So if you kind of educate yourself about the issue, a lot of it is just talking to families and saying, like, this is what we know about it. This is what we know about how it may impact his ability to do well in school, or his health, or what are some of the signs and symptoms of trauma, and helping people understand that. Empathizing, normalizing responses. Sometimes people feel like, they're having these thoughts in their head about a traumatic event, and they feel like they're crazy, like they're the only ones that's ever happened to. And when they're asked about it and talk about it, and they hear that they're not the only person that's experiencing that, it's actually normal for people that have experienced traumatic events to think about it, to have intrusive thoughts. That can be very relieving. One thing that I would caution you about, especially if you're not a clinician and you're not providing therapy, is to be careful about how much detail you go into about specific trauma exposures. Right? I think it's okay to talk generally and broadly about what they've experienced, but probably not to go into the detail of what happened in a lot of detail. And what you can do is, if you have any sense that this is a concern for a kid, is make a referral and let a trained therapist do that work. And you can let the kid know, it sounds like you really want to talk about this, or it's really upsetting. I think it would be helpful for you to talk to a therapist who really is experienced in dealing with this type of concern. And I say that because once you start getting into a lot of detail, that's where it can be re-traumatizing. Disclosure has a big impact on recovery. So, we have folks now, talking to families about trauma, and sometimes new events come out. And, if either because you've asked or just, a kid volunteers and says, oh, by the way, I saw my friend get shot the other day. That disclosure, the first time that kid is telling somebody about an event, is a very important moment. And so it's where, all of these things are important. Listen, empathize, normalize, help instill some hope, make a referral. But be very careful about avoidance, and be careful about that instinct that we all have to say, oh my God, I can't, I'm not the person to talk about this, I can't deal with it. And to either, blatantly or inadvertently shut down that child or person who's making a disclosure. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions about any of those things? All right. Say a couple things about treatment. So I mentioned there are treatments increasingly available in Connecticut. There are actually now hundreds and hundreds of trauma treatments that are demonstrated by research to be effective for children and adolescents and adults. This is one website that lists many of them. These are some of the common, just for those of you that are not therapists or are therapists that aren't trained in these models, some of the common approaches that they use. They're fostering attachment between a parent and a child, or a caregiver and a child, providing education about trauma, kind of like I'm doing now, understanding behavior, so the what's happened to you instead of what's wrong with you, and then a lot on emotional regulation and self-regulation, managing the anxiety and distress and the shame and the guilt and anger that may be associated, coping strategies, regulation skills, and then building resilience so that if a child is re-traumatized or facing another event, they have some internal capacity to respond and to hopefully support themselves or get the support they need. In Middletown, there are a few resources here that I've highlighted, and this is where Justin or others probably know of or may know of more. Child First is an in-home intervention. Trauma-focused CBT is an outpatient intervention. It's offered in a few spots in the area. And then the Middlesex Early Head Start Partnership. Is there anybody here from that? No, not today. Okay. So I probably couldn't tell you too much about it, but it's another resource for the younger kids. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to say much about trauma-focused CBT, but I'd be happy to talk more afterwards if you want. Cbits is one I do want to mention because it's a school-based intervention. It's a little bit different. Is anybody in here involved in Cbits? Any chance? No? It's a school-based intervention for kids who've experienced trauma. It's now being disseminated across Connecticut, and I don't know offhand if there's any schools in Middletown yet. There may not be. It's in the, relatively new in Connecticut. But it's being disseminated through the state. And, as with everybody else, we're kind of waiting on the state budget to see what this is going to look like next year. But hopefully it will continue, even if it's not as robust as it has been. And there will be opportunities, or hopefully will be opportunities, to train new clinicians in schools next fall. And it's an evidence-based model, and so far there have been about 500 kids, almost 500 kids in Connecticut that have gotten it. This line here shows you likely PTSD diagnosis for children. So these are kids being seen in schools Before the group, most of them were well above the PTSD. They probably had PTSD diagnosis. After the 10 sessions, they're a little bit below the line, meaning that most of them no longer have PTSD. So it's a very efficient, very effective intervention, and it's now adapted for as young as K through 5 in what's called Bounce Back. So that may be a resource. Again, we'll see once the budget passes. I also want to, is anybody familiar with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network website? If you want to learn more about child trauma, this is the first place I would recommend that you go. nctsn.org. I see the link's not up there, but if you Google that, nctsn.org, everything is free, and they have handouts for professionals, for parents, for youth, for teachers, for therapists, for anybody, on every type of trauma, every type of reaction. They also have a learning center, also free, where you can view archived webinars about hundreds and hundreds of topics. And they have everything from pediatric or trauma and pediatric primary care to schools to young children to military veterans and everything in between. Some other resources here. You don't have to write them down because I will send the slides if you want to learn more about trauma. And then I think finally, some recommendations for getting started, which I think we probably talk about after the movie. And I think just getting together here is one way to get started.
Also, I'm from the Women and Family Center, and the dynamic of trauma that we focus on is sexual violence. One of my coworkers, like 90% of her clients are children, because 1 out of 4 females will encounter sexual assault before they're 18, and 1 out of 6. So it's worrisome because looking at that population, they're the most vulnerable. And especially if going through abuse in their family homes, they're not going to reveal to anyone or disclose to anyone what they're going through. So then you can just, somebody mentioned self-medication and self-medication for their outlet, and that has been majority of what people go to heal through their trauma. So our services are free, and we do offer counseling for families and individuals, whether they're male too, because our agency is called Women and Family Center, but we do service males as well. And it's so prevalent, but it's also a taboo in society because we do go into schools and we do community outreach, but some people are like, this doesn't really happen here, or just give me your email, your name, and then we'll get back to you. And nobody really wants to talk about it, but if you look at it, it's such a chain reaction. Like, you look into schools, there's some students who aren't behaving well, and teachers are like, not saying all of them, but they're like, this kid is just acting out. This person we're gonna suspend this person, but there's no healing, there's no getting to the root of why this person is acting this way. So, like you said, being attentive and noticing a pattern and distress in students and trying to find the root of what's going on. You don't have to service that person, but knowing the resources that are available to help that person so they don't end up, not getting the healing that they need through it is crucial. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, and we do serve the whole Middlesex County, but we're located in Middletown, Meriden, and New Haven.
What ages?
We don't have a limitation to ages, because sometimes we service as young as like 6 to like 75 or older. So there's no age limit or age to who we service.
Thank you. It's a good resource. Yes.
Of course, in my company, the recovery care, we are also aware that the staff can be affected by their own trauma. And you mentioned that you can't walk in water without getting wet. And even if you believe you can walk on water, you will get wet. So we have a staff who have the lived experience of being addicted and also working with people day after day. So we have a two-hatted meeting for people who do straddle both universes to help cut down burnout, relapse, and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
It's very important to take care of yourself. And that figure you had about the oxygen mask, I emphasize that you must first put it on yourself.
Yeah.
Then we can help other people.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I know if there are any statewide efforts
to have kind of a trauma-informed practice, for lack of a better word, infused into any teacher training programs for either early care and education or K-12, or I mean, I guess even college. But is there any move to have that kind of as a mandatory aspect of either teacher or administrator training? It seems like the burden right now is falling to the municipalities because we're not there yet. But over time, that burden could shift to the training programs, which would certainly be a lot more effective and efficient. I don't know if that's happening, because I think probably a lot of us would help to push that if it were.
Yeah, you wanted to comment on that?
I was just at Central, and they were telling me about a new mandate that all of their beginning teachers have to go through SEL training.
Yeah, and I think there is now some movement, or there's interest now, I think, statewide, and including the Department of Ed, in this idea of like trauma-informed schools. And our agency, CHI, has been involved in some initial kind of convenings and meetings with different folks around the state to think about what that would look like, which includes, teacher training, as well as some of the other things that I mentioned. I'm not quite sure where that will lead, especially right now, but I think there's a lot of interest and momentum in it. It's just, the climate is tough. But in terms of the early care and education, the other thing that I didn't mention is we've recently been part of a SAMHSA grant that's focused on trauma in early childhood in Connecticut. And part of what we're doing is disseminating some interventions for young children. Unfortunately, not in Middletown yet, but another part of that is to look at the early care and education training, curriculum, and to develop something on trauma for those folks in early education, home visitors, Head Start, and everybody else who's serving young kids. So we're really in the beginning of that, but we are working on it and working with United Way and OEC to develop some basic content.
That's very important. Just to make a point on trauma-informed care. A lot of nonprofits and human services should have that in their company.
Yes.
For the staff.
For the staff, yeah. Yes. Yeah.
We've spoken in general about attachment, but I didn't see any verbiage regarding RED. Any correlation or anything in regards to trauma and RED?
Well, I think, I think the principles of, attachment and trauma-informed care are consistent with, with how we would think about kids who have impaired attachments, including reactive attachment. I think, the other thing is that sometimes, I'm not an expert in RAD, so I'll be careful what I say, but I think there's some controversy around it. And it may be an area where there's misdiagnosis. If somebody calls it RAD, other people may call it PTSD. And how the best way to intervene with those kids, there may be some differences of opinion in how we do that. I think in the trauma-informed care world, we would always focus on attachment as much as possible, no matter how old the kid is. And even with the 16, 17-year-olds, while they're certainly different, we do try to include parents in trauma treatment and other services. So I know that may not answer your question completely, but yeah.
I think the circumstances that lead to RAD itself is really traumatic events. So I see the two of them kind of being really close. If you didn't experience secure attachment growing up, is it because of neglect? Is it because of abuse? So all that, I think, kind of goes together.
All right, you want to?
Well, so
Take
let's
away.
give another round of applause.
Thank you.